If I had to start learning English again in 2026, knowing everything I know now about how the brain actually acquires language, I wouldn't start with grammar. I wouldn't download 5 different apps and try to use them all at the same time. And I definitely, absolutely would not force myself to speak English out loud on day one. Because all of those things feel logical, they feel productive, they feel like the responsible thing to do when you're trying to learn a language seriously. But they all share the same hidden problem. They focus on the outside of language, the visible part, the part you can measure and track and show to other people, when the real work of becoming fluent happens somewhere much quieter, somewhere most people never think to look.
And that's what this episode is really about. It's about what we would do differently if we had to start over. Not because the traditional methods are completely wrong, but because in 2026, we understand so much more about how memory works, how the brain builds language pathways, how stress affects learning, and how the feeling of fluency is created long before you ever open your mouth to speak.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Mike.
And you're listening to the English Conversation Podcast. If you listened to our last episode, you know we talked about why so many English learners understand everything they hear, but freeze the moment they try to speak.
Right.
And we explained that the freeze isn't about vocabulary. It's not about laziness. It's about how your brain is still translating instead of thinking, and how that translation process overloads your mental bandwidth and causes everything to just shut down in the moment.
Right. And a lot of people reached out after that episode and said, okay, I understand why I freeze now. I understand that I need to think in English before I can speak in English, but how do I actually build that? Like, if I could go back to the beginning, if I could start my English learning journey over again with this new understanding, what would I actually do differently from day one?
And that's such a good question, because I think a lot of us, when we start learning English, we follow a path that feels obvious. We buy textbooks, we download apps, we try to memorize word lists organized by topic, like food or travel or business, and we spend a lot of time memorizing words. And on the surface, this makes perfect sense, because you need words to communicate, and the more words you know, the more you should be able to say.
Right, and I think this approach feels really satisfying at the beginning because you can see progress. Like you start with 0 English words, and then after a week, you know 50 words, and after a month, you know 200 words. And it feels like you're building something real, something measurable.
Exactly, but here's the problem, and this is something I wish I had understood earlier, which is that there's a huge difference between recognizing a word and being able to retrieve that word when you need it in a conversation. And most vocabulary learning methods focus on recognition, not retrieval.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So recognition is when you see a word or hear a word and you understand what it means. Like if I show you a flashcard that says exhausted and you think, oh, that means very tired. That's recognition. You've successfully identified the word.
Okay.
But retrieval is different. Retrieval is when you're in the middle of a conversation and you want to express the feeling of being very tired. And the word exhausted comes to your mind automatically, without you having to search for it, without you having to translate from your native language. It just appears in your thoughts naturally.
So recognition is passive. You're responding to something you see or hear, but retrieval is active. You're pulling the word out of your memory when there's no prompt, when there's nothing helping you remember it except your own need to communicate.
Exactly. And the problem with most vocabulary apps is that they train recognition really well, but they don't train retrieval at all. Because every time you study a flashcard, the word is right there in front of you. You're just matching it to a meaning. You're not practicing the much harder skill of generating that word from scratch when you need it.
And that's why so many learners have this experience where they study hundreds of words, they feel like they know so much vocabulary, but then when they try to speak, none of those words come to them, and they end up using the same basic words over and over again, like good and bad and nice, because those are the only words their brain can retrieve under pressure.
Right. And this is where the brain's trust system comes in, because your brain doesn't trust words that you've only seen on flashcards. It doesn't consider those words truly available, truly part of your active language, because you've never used them in a real context. You've never felt them. You've never experienced the moment of needing that word and successfully pulling it out and using it to communicate something meaningful.
So it's not enough to just know what a word means. You have to have a relationship with that word.
You have to have used it, thought with it, felt it in different contexts, and only then does your brain start to trust that the word will be there when you need it.
Exactly. And this is why, if I were starting over, I wouldn't focus on collecting vocabulary at all. I would focus on deeply understanding and using a smaller set of words in many different contexts. Because fluency isn't about knowing 10,000 words, it's about knowing 2,000 words so well that you can use them flexibly, creatively, automatically, without thinking.
And I think that's such an important shift in mindset because we've been conditioned to think that more is always better. More vocabulary, more grammar rules, more resources. But in language learning, depth is actually more valuable than breadth. Using fewer words deeply is more powerful than knowing many words shallowly.
Right, and this connects to the second thing I would do differently, which is that I would not force myself to speak English on day one. And I know that's controversial because everyone says you have to speak from the beginning, you have to get over your fear, you have to just practice. But I genuinely believe that pushing yourself to speak before your brain is ready creates more problems than it solves.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that language learners make, and it's not their fault because the advice is everywhere. Everyone tells you, just speak, don't worry about mistakes, just open your mouth and practice. And that advice works for some people, especially people who are naturally confident or extroverted. But for a lot of learners, especially people who are more introverted or perfectionistic, or who have already experienced the feeling of freezing up in a conversation, forcing yourself to speak too early just reinforces anxiety.
Exactly, because speaking is cognitively demanding. It requires you to access words quickly, it requires you to form sentences in real time, it requires you to monitor your pronunciation and grammar and meaning all at once. And if your brain hasn't built the foundation for any of those skills yet, then speaking just becomes an exercise in panic. You're standing there desperately trying to translate from your native language while someone is staring at you waiting for an answer, and your brain is screaming at you that you're failing. And that feeling of failure gets encoded in your memory. And the next time you try to speak, your brain remembers that terrible feeling and it tries to protect you by shutting down.
So instead of building confidence, you're actually building a fear response. You're training your brain to associate speaking English with stress and embarrassment and inadequacy.
Right. And this is why I would approach speaking completely differently if I were starting over. I would start with silent practice first. I would spend weeks, maybe even months, just thinking in English privately, forming sentences in my head, talking to myself internally, building that inner voice. And only once that felt relatively comfortable, only once I could form basic thoughts in English without having to translate, would I even consider speaking out loud to another person.
And I know some people might hear that and think, wait, that sounds like it would take forever. That sounds so slow. But the truth is, this approach is actually faster in the long run because you're building real internal fluency, instead of just forcing yourself through uncomfortable conversations that don't actually change how your brain processes language.
Exactly. And this brings us to grammar, which is the third thing I would approach completely differently. Because I think the way grammar is taught in most courses and textbooks is almost backwards from how the brain actually learns it.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
So, traditional grammar teaching treats grammar as a subject like math or history, something you study explicitly, something you memorize rules for, something you practice through exercises and drills. And yes, you need to understand grammar at some level, you need to know how English is structured. But if you approach grammar as a subject to master, you end up with a very analytical relationship to the language, where you're constantly monitoring yourself, constantly checking whether you're following the rules. And that analytical mode is the opposite of fluency.
Right, because fluency is intuitive, it's automatic. It's that feeling of words just flowing without you having to think about why you're saying them that way. And you can't get to that intuitive place if you're always analyzing, always second guessing, always asking yourself, wait, is this present perfect or past simple? Is this the right preposition? Should I use in or on or at?
Exactly. So if I were starting over, I wouldn't study grammar as a separate subject at all. I would treat grammar as a map, not a destination. Meaning I would use grammar explanations to help me understand patterns I notice in real English. But I wouldn't try to memorize rules or do grammar exercises. I would just expose myself to correct English over and over again through listening and reading, and I would trust that my brain would absorb the patterns naturally the same way children do.
And I think that's really key because children don't learn grammar by studying it. They learn it by hearing it thousands of times in context, and eventually their brain just figures out the pattern. Like, okay, when we're talking about something that happened yesterday, we use this form. And when we're talking about something that's happening now, we use this other form. And they don't need to know the names of those forms or the technical rules, they just feel what sounds right.
Right, and that feeling of what sounds right is what we're trying to build. And you can't build it through grammar exercises. You can only build it through massive amounts of input, through listening to English, reading English, absorbing English in contexts where the meaning is clear and interesting to you.
So, grammar becomes something you consult when you're confused, not something you study systematically from the beginning.
Exactly. It's like having a map when you're exploring a new city. You glance at the map when you're lost or when you want to understand where you are, but you don't sit at home studying the map before you ever go outside. You go outside and explore, and the map is just there to help you make sense of what you're experiencing.
I love that analogy. And I think it also connects with something we talked about in the last episode, which is this idea of internal fluency. This idea that fluency is built first in your mind, in your inner voice, before it ever comes out of your mouth. And I think if I were starting over, I would spend so much more time training that inner voice, just practicing the skill of thinking in English without any pressure to speak.
Yes, and this is maybe the most important thing we could talk about today, because I think most learners completely underestimate how much work needs to happen internally before speaking becomes natural. They think, okay, I understand English, so now I just need to practice speaking it. But there's actually a huge middle stage that they're skipping, which is the stage where you learn to think in English, where you learn to form thoughts in English automatically without having to translate.
And this internal thinking, this inner voice, is where real fluency lives. Because when you speak, you're not creating language from scratch. You're just voicing thoughts that are already formed in your mind. So if your thoughts are in your native language, then you have to translate them into English before you can speak them. And that's slow and exhausting. But if your thoughts are already in English, then speaking is just a matter of opening your mouth and letting those thoughts out.
Exactly. And this is why native speakers don't freeze. Not because we have better vocabulary or better grammar, but because we're already thinking in English. So when someone asks us a question, we don't have to do any translation, we don't have to construct a response. The response is just there in our mind in English, and we speak it.
So how do you train that inner voice? How do you get your brain to start thinking in English instead of constantly translating?
So the first thing to understand is that you can't force it. You can't just decide one day, okay, from now on, I'm going to think in English, and expect your brain to comply. Because your native language is your brain's default mode. It's the language you've been thinking in your entire life. It's where your brain feels safe and fast. So if you try to suddenly switch to English, your brain is just going to resist. It's going to keep pulling you back to your native language because that's more efficient.
So you have to make the transition gradual. You have to let your brain get comfortable with English slowly in small doses without pressure.
Exactly. And the way you do that is by practicing fragmented thinking, which is this idea that you don't need to think in complete, grammatically perfect sentences. You just need to start labeling things in English, noticing things in English, reacting to things in English, even if it's just a word or two.
Can you give an example?
Sure. So let's say you're walking down the street and you see a dog. Instead of thinking in your native language, oh, look at that cute dog, you just think in English, cute dog, or even just dog. And that's it. That's enough. You're not trying to form a full sentence. You're just training your brain to use English as a thinking language. And if you do that consistently, if you just sprinkle little bits of English thinking throughout your day, your brain will gradually start to trust English more. It will start to feel more natural. And over time, those fragments will naturally expand into full thoughts.
And I think that's so much more realistic than what most people try to do, which is narrate their entire day in perfect English sentences, which is overwhelming and exhausting and not sustainable.
Right, and the fragmented approach is also closer to how we actually think. Because if you pay attention to your thoughts in your native language, they're not neat and organized. They're messy, they're incomplete, they jump around, they're full of half-formed ideas and reactions and associations. And that's normal. That's how thinking works. So when you're training your inner voice in English, you don't need to be perfect, you just need to be present. You just need to let English be part of your mental landscape.
And over time, as you do this more and more, those fragments start to connect. They start to flow into each other, and eventually you find yourself forming full thoughts in English without even trying. And that's when you know your inner voice is starting to develop.
Exactly. And once that inner voice is there, once you can think basic thoughts in English relatively automatically, that's when speaking stops being so difficult, because you're not translating anymore. You're just voicing what's already in your mind.
So let's talk about resources, because I think this is another area where most learners, myself included when I was learning other languages, make the mistake of thinking more is better. Like, I'll download every app, I'll follow every YouTube channel, I'll buy every course, and somehow the combination of all these resources will make me fluent faster.
Right, and I understand why people do this, because when you're motivated to learn something, you want to use every tool available. You want to maximize your progress. And the internet makes it so easy to access hundreds of different resources. But the problem is that using too many resources actually fragments your learning. It prevents your brain from building deep automatic pathways because you're constantly switching between different voices, different methods, different explanations, and your brain never gets a chance to settle into one approach and really master it.
So it's like if you're trying to learn a song, you're much better off listening to the same recording over and over again until you know it deeply, rather than listening to 50 different versions of the song once each, because with the first approach, the song gets encoded in your memory in a very specific way. You know every note, every pause, every nuance. But with the second approach, you end up with a vague sense of the song, but no deep familiarity with any particular version.
That's a perfect analogy, and it's exactly what happens with language learning. When you use one podcast or one YouTube channel or one course consistently, you get familiar with the voice, the rhythm, the pacing, the way they explain things. And that familiarity makes it easier for your brain to absorb the content because you're not constantly adjusting to new styles and new formats. You're just deepening your understanding of material presented in a familiar way.
And there's also something powerful about repetition, because when you listen to the same voice over and over again, your brain starts to internalize not just the words, but the way that person uses language, the way they structure sentences, the way they express ideas, and that becomes part of your own internal model of English.
Exactly. And this is why, if I were starting over, I would choose maybe 2 or 3 resources maximum, like one podcast, one YouTube channel, maybe one grammar reference book for when I'm confused. And I would stick with those resources for months. I would go deep with them. I would listen to episodes multiple times. I would really absorb the way those speakers use language. And I would resist the temptation to constantly search for new resources because I know that depth is more valuable than variety.
And I think this also reduces overwhelm, because when you're using 10 different resources, you're constantly feeling like you should be doing more. You should be checking this app, you should be watching that video, you should be reviewing these flashcards. And it becomes this endless to-do list that never feels complete. But when you commit to just a few resources, you can actually finish things. You can actually feel a sense of progress and completion, and that's psychologically so much healthier.
Right, and it also builds trust because when you keep coming back to the same resources, your brain starts to trust them. It starts to feel like, okay, this is my home base. This is where I go to learn English. And that sense of stability and trust makes learning feel safer, less chaotic, more manageable.
So we've talked about vocabulary, about speaking, about grammar, about the inner voice, and about resources. And I think there's one more thing we should talk about, which is this idea of flow versus fluency. Because I think a lot of learners are chasing fluency. They want to speak perfectly. They want to sound like a native speaker. They want to never make mistakes. But actually, what they should be chasing is flow, which is something different.
Yes, and this is such an important distinction because fluency, the way most people think about it, implies perfection. It implies speaking without errors, speaking quickly, speaking smoothly, sounding native, and that's an incredibly high bar. It's a bar that most learners will never reach, even after years of study. And chasing that bar can be really demoralizing because you're always measuring yourself against an impossible standard.
Right, but flow is different. Flow is about continuity. It's about being able to express your thoughts without constantly stopping and starting, without freezing up, without getting stuck searching for words. And you can have flow even if your grammar isn't perfect, even if your pronunciation isn't native, even if you make mistakes, because flow is about the movement of ideas, not the perfection of form.
Exactly. And if you listen to native speakers in real conversations, we don't speak perfectly either. We pause, we use filler words like and like and you know, we correct ourselves mid-sentence, we forget words, we say things awkwardly, but we have flow. We keep talking, we keep expressing our ideas, and the conversation moves forward. And that's what communication is really about. It's about moving ideas from one person's mind to another person's mind. And as long as you're doing that, you are succeeding.
And I think this is so liberating because it gives you permission to be imperfect. It gives you permission to sound like a learner. Because even if you sound like a learner, as long as you have flow, as long as you can keep expressing yourself without freezing, you're communicating effectively. And that's the whole point.
Right. And this is why if I were starting over, I would focus on building flow first and worry about perfection later. I would practice speaking in a way where I prioritize continuity over correctness, where I allow myself to make mistakes, where I use simple words if I don't know the fancy ones, where I keep talking even if I'm not sure I'm saying things the right way. Because that practice of keeping the flow going is what builds confidence, and confidence is what eventually leads to fluency.
And the irony is that the more you chase perfection, the harder it is to achieve flow because you're constantly monitoring yourself, constantly interrupting yourself to correct errors, constantly hesitating, and all of that breaks the flow. But if you let go of perfection and just focus on expressing yourself, the flow improves. And as the flow improves, the language naturally gets better over time.
Exactly, because flow is what allows you to practice. Flow is what allows you to have real conversations. And real conversations are where the learning happens. That's where you start to internalize patterns. That's where you start to notice what works and what doesn't. That's where your brain gets the feedback it needs to improve.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground here. And if someone's been listening to this whole episode, they might be feeling a little overwhelmed. Like, okay, there's so much I could be doing differently. Where do I even start?
Right, and I think the most important thing to remember is that you don't have to do everything at once. You don't have to completely change your entire approach overnight. You just need to start making small shifts, small changes in how you think about language learning. And those small shifts will compound over time into big results.
So maybe the first shift is just recognizing that vocabulary isn't about quantity, it's about depth. And instead of trying to learn new words every day, you focus on really using the words you already know in different contexts, in different sentences, in different thoughts, until those words become automatic.
And maybe the second shift is giving yourself permission not to speak yet. Giving yourself permission to spend time just thinking in English, just building that inner voice, just training your brain to form English thoughts without pressure, and trusting that the speaking will come later when you're ready.
And maybe the third shift is approaching grammar not as something to master, but as something to reference. Something to help you understand patterns, but not something to stress about. Not something to let block your flow.
And maybe the fourth shift is simplifying your resources, choosing just a few sources that you really connect with and going deep with them, building familiarity, building trust, instead of constantly jumping from one thing to another looking for the perfect course or the perfect method.
And maybe the fifth shift is redefining your goal from fluency to flow, from perfection to continuity, from sounding native to simply expressing yourself and letting that be enough.
And if you make those shifts, if you approach English learning with this deeper understanding of how the brain actually acquires language, You're going to progress faster, you're going to feel less stressed, and you're going to build a relationship with English that feels natural and sustainable, not forced and exhausting.
So let's bring this all together, because I think what we're really saying in this episode is that if you're starting to learn English in 2026, or if you're restarting your English learning journey with a new mindset, the most important thing is to understand that language learning isn't about collecting information. It's not about memorizing words and rules and facts. It's about training your brain to use language automatically, intuitively, without thinking.
And that kind of learning doesn't happen through force. It doesn't happen through stress. It doesn't happen through trying to do everything at once. It happens through patience, through consistency, through giving your brain the time and space it needs to build new pathways, new habits, new ways of thinking.
And it happens through starting in the right place, which isn't with speaking, it's with listening, it's with absorbing. It's with letting English become familiar, and then slowly, gradually, gently training your inner voice, training your ability to think in English. And only then, when that foundation is there, moving into speaking.
And along the way, it's about being kind to yourself. It's about recognizing that mistakes are normal, that imperfection is part of the process, that flow is more important than fluency, and that every small step you take, every small thought you form in English, every moment you resist the urge to translate is building something real, even if you can't see it yet.
Because language learning isn't linear. It doesn't progress in a steady upward line where every day you're noticeably better than the day before. It's more like layers, where you're building depth and foundation for weeks or months without seeing much visible progress, and then suddenly something clicks. Suddenly you have a conversation and the words just flow. Suddenly you're thinking in English without trying, and you realize, oh, all that quiet work was actually doing something.
Right, and that's why patience is so important, and why trusting the process is so important. Because the progress is happening even when you can't feel it. Your brain is making connections, it's building pathways, it's internalizing patterns, and all of that invisible work is what eventually leads to the visible result of fluency.
So if this episode resonated with you, if you felt like, yes, this is exactly what I needed to hear, this is exactly how I want to approach English from now on, do us a favor and leave a comment. Just type the word reset, because that's what this is. It's a reset. It's a new way of thinking about language learning. And we love to know that this message reached the people who need to hear it.
And if you're someone who's been learning English for a while and you're feeling stuck, or you're feeling like you're working so hard but not seeing results, I want you to know that it's not because you're not capable. It's not because you're not smart enough. It's probably just because you've been focusing on the wrong things or doing the right things in the wrong order. And that's okay, because now you know, and you can adjust and you can start building your English learning journey in a way that actually works with your brain instead of against it.
And remember, slow progress is still progress. Invisible progress is still progress. And the work you're doing right now, even if it feels small, even if it feels like nothing is changing, is building the foundation for everything that comes next.
So be patient with yourself. Be kind to yourself, and trust that if you keep showing up, if you keep thinking in English a little bit every day, if you keep absorbing English through listening and reading, if you keep building that inner voice, the speaking will come, the fluency will come, and it will feel natural, not forced.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Take care, and remember, you're not behind. You're exactly where you need to be.